The hum of the engines was a steady backdrop to the calm of the cabin. Passengers settled into their seats, some flipping through in-flight magazines, others scrolling through their phones. A few children giggled softly while their parents offered snacks and whispered reminders to stay quiet. It was just another ordinary flight, or at least it seemed that way. Among the passengers were two boys, no older than 10, sitting near the middle of the plane. They were wide-eyed with curiosity, whispering to each other as they watched the flight attendants move gracefully up and down the aisle. To anyone else, they were just two kids excited about flying. But they had noticed something no one else seemed to see. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling it was time for passengers to settle in. The boys, however, couldn't relax. One of them, the older of the two, nudged his brother, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see it? Over there by the door." The younger boy nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, it was weird, like really weird." Neither of them knew exactly what to do. They weren't sure if they should tell someone or if they were just imagining things. But then, as if on cue, the older boy leaned forward and peered down the aisle, scanning the faces of the flight attendants. He hesitated for a moment before making a decision. "Come on," he whispered, grabbing his brother's hand. Together, they unbuckled their seatbelts and stepped quietly down the narrow aisle. Passengers barely noticed as they maneuvered past rows of seats, their movements quick but cautious. At the front of the plane, the flight attendants were busy preparing drinks and snacks. The boys hesitated just out of sight, their small frames pressed against the cool metal wall of the galley. The younger one tugged on his brother's sleeve. "What if they don't believe us?" "They have to," the older one replied. "If we're right, they'll have to." Finally, summoning all their courage, the boys stepped into the galley. One of the flight attendants, a kind-looking woman with a polished smile, crouched down to their level. "Hi there, can I help you with something?" The older boy glanced nervously at his brother before speaking. We need to talk to the pilot. It's really important." The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback. "The pilot? Why would you need to talk to him?" The younger boy's voice trembled. "We saw something. Back there, near the cargo door." Her expression softened, but her concern was evident. "What did you see?" The older boy shook his head. "We can't explain it. We just have to tell the pilot. Please." For a moment, the flight attendant hesitated. Protocol dictated that passengers, especially children, weren't allowed into the cockpit without a valid reason. But something in the boy's urgency struck a chord. She rose to her full height, her brow furrowing as she glanced toward the cockpit door. "Wait here," she said, her tone now serious. The boy stood frozen as the flight attendant disappeared into the cockpit, her heels clicking against the floor. Minutes passed, though to the boys it felt like hours. Finally, the door opened, and the pilot himself stepped out, his uniform crisp and his expression calm but curious. "I hear you boys wanted to talk to me," he said, crouching slightly to meet their gaze. "What's going on?" The older boy took a deep breath and leaned in close, his voice a whisper so quiet the pilot had to strain to hear it. "One word." That's all he said, but it was enough to make the pilot's eyes widen in alarm. Without another word, the pilot straightened, his demeanor changing instantly. He spun on his heel and strode back into the cockpit, slamming the door shut behind him. In seconds, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need everyone to remain calm and stay in your seats. Flight attendants, please prepare for an immediate lockdown." Gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged nervous glances. The boys stood frozen in the galley, their hearts pounding. They didn't know what would happen next, but they knew one thing for certain. Whatever they had seen, it was serious enough to send the entire plane into high alert. The cabin erupted into a low hum of whispers, punctuated by worried glances and furrowed brows. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some craning their necks to see if they could catch a glimpse of what was happening up front. Others clutched their armrests, their minds racing with worst-case scenarios. But no one knew the full story, except for the two boys, now standing awkwardly in the galley. The flight attendant who had first spoken to them crouched down again, her voice soft but urgent. "What did you say to him? What's going on?" Her calm demeanor was cracking, worry seeping into her tone. The older boy hesitated, glancing at his brother, who looked like he might cry. "We can't explain everything," he said finally, "but we saw something near the cargo door. It didn't look normal. Not normal, she pressed, her brow furrowing. What does that mean? It was moving, the younger boy said, his voice shaky. And it wasn't supposed to be there. Before the attendant could ask more, the cockpit door opened again, and the copilot stepped out. He was younger than the captain, with a sharp, focused look in his eyes. He motioned for the flight attendant to step aside and crouched down to address the boys. "Listen, I need you to be very clear with me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly did you see? Every detail matters right now." The older boy fidgeted with the hem of his t-shirt, clearly struggling to find the words. It was like a bag or something at first, but then it moved, like it was alive. And there was this noise, kind of like scratching. The copilot's jaw tightened, and he exchanged a glance with the flight attendant. It was subtle, but the boys could tell it wasn't a good sign. "Okay," the copilot said, standing up. "Thank you for telling us. You've done the right thing. But what is it?" The older boy asked, his voice rising slightly. "Is it dangerous?" The copilot didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to the flight attendant. "Keep them here. Make sure they don't move." Without another word, he disappeared back into the cockpit, shutting the door behind him. The boys were left standing there, hearts racing, as the flight attendant tried to distract them with reassurances that rang hollow. "Everything's going to be fine," she said with a forced smile. "The pilot and copilot just need to check something. Why don't you sit down here and have some water?" They obeyed, but neither of them touched the plastic cup she handed them. Instead, they sat stiffly on the galley floor, their imaginations running wild. Whatever they had seen, whatever it was, had been serious enough to make grown-ups panic. That thought alone was enough to make their stomachs churn. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the tension was palpable. The pilot and copilot worked quickly, pulling up security footage from the cargo bay. The grainy video feed flickered to life on a small screen, showing rows of luggage stacked neatly in the confined space. At first, everything seemed normal, but then there it was, a shadow shifting in the corner of the screen. The pilot leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell is that?" The copilot shook his head. "I don't know, but it's moving." The shadow darted across the screen again, this time knocking over a small crate. The sound of the crash was faint but audible through the feed. The two men exchanged a glance, their worry mirrored in each other's expressions. "We can't risk it," the pilot said finally. "We're going to have to do a full lockdown. Notify air traffic control and request an emergency landing." The copilot nodded and reached for the radio. As he began to relay the situation, the pilot turned his attention back to the screen, his mind racing. He had seen a lot in his years of flying, from engine malfunctions to unruly passengers, but this was different. This was something he couldn't explain, and that made it all the more terrifying. Back in the cabin, the mood had shifted from confusion to outright fear. The captain's earlier announcement about lockdown procedures had set everyone on edge, and the flight attendants were now moving through the aisles, quietly instructing passengers to stay seated and fasten their seatbelts. Some passengers complied without question, while others demanded answers. "What's going on?" one man asked, his voice loud enough to carry over the hum of the engines. "Why are we locking down the plane?" The flight attendants offered the same rehearsed response to everyone. "The captain is taking precautions to ensure everyone's safety. Please remain calm." But calm was the last thing anyone felt, especially the boys. From their spot in the galley, they could hear snippets of conversation between the crew. Words like "unknown object" and "cargo bay" drifted to their ears, making their stomachs twist with guilt and fear. They hadn't meant to cause this much trouble. They just wanted to keep everyone safe. "What if it's nothing?" The younger boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "What if we're wrong?" The older boy shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "We're not wrong. I know what I saw." As the minutes dragged on, the plane began to descend, the soft hum of the engines shifting as the aircraft adjusted its altitude. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been given clearance for an emergency landing. I need everyone to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." The announcement sent another ripple of unease through the passengers. Some clutched the arms of their seats, while others whispered frantically to their neighbors. The boys could feel the tension rising, and their own nerves began to fray. The older boy finally turned to the flight attendant who had stayed with them. "Can we help? We don't want to just sit here." She smiled weakly, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. "You've already helped more than you know. Just stay here, okay? Everything's going to be fine. But even as she said it, her eyes betrayed her doubt. As the descent continued, the plane's lights flickered briefly, drawing startled gasps from the passengers. The younger boy clutched his brother's arm tightly, his small hand trembling. "What if it's moving again?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. The older boy didn't answer. He stared straight ahead, his mind replaying the image they had seen near the cargo door. It wasn't just the movement that had scared him. It was the way it had felt, like whatever was down there wasn't supposed to be on the plane. He couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. In the cockpit, the pilot and copilot were working in synchronized urgency. Air traffic control was guiding them to a secluded runway at the nearest airport, far from the bustling terminals. The copilot glanced at the pilot, his voice low but tense. "Do you think we're dealing with a stowaway? Or something else?" The pilot didn't look up from the controls. "I don't know. And until we're on the ground, I don't want to make any assumptions. Our job is to get these people down safely." The copilot nodded, though unease lingered in his eyes. He couldn't stop thinking about the grainy footage, the way the shadow moved unnaturally through the cargo bay. Whatever it wasn't behaving like any stowaway he'd ever heard of. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating. Passengers whispered frantically, trying to make sense of what was happening. One woman clutched her toddler tightly, murmuring reassurances even as her own fear shone in her eyes. A man in a business suit tapped furiously on his phone, though the in-flight Wi-Fi had been cut off as part of the lockdown. The boys remained in the galley, their eyes darting nervously toward the cockpit door. They could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them, heavier with every passing second. The older boy finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We have to tell them everything we saw. Maybe it'll help." The flight attendant crouched beside them again, her calm facade cracking under the pressure. "You've already told us plenty," she said, though her voice wavered. "The captain and crew are handling it. You just need to stay safe." "But what if it's dangerous?" The younger boy blurted out, his voice rising slightly. "What if it hurts someone?" The flight attendant hesitated, clearly at a loss for words. Before she could respond, a loud thud echoed through the plane. It was faint, barely audible over the engines, but it was enough to make every head snap toward the source of the sound. "What was that?" a woman in the back whispered, her voice tinged with panic. Another thud followed, louder this time. It was coming from below, somewhere near the cargo bay. The boys exchanged a wide-eyed glance, their worst fears now confirmed. Whatever they had seen wasn't staying still, and it was getting closer. The flight attendants moved swiftly, their professionalism kicking into overdrive. One of them grabbed the intercom and spoke with a calm authority that belied her expression. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and stay calm. We are preparing to land and the crew is taking all necessary precautions." But calm was no longer an option for most of the passengers. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs grew into nervous chatter. The thuds continued, irregular but unmistakable, sending ripples of fear through the cabin. The boys couldn't take it anymore. The older one stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. "You have to tell the captain it's moving," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. The flight attendant tried to usher him back down, but he shook his head. "No, we saw it. It's not just a bag or a box. It's something else, and it's trying to get out." Her face paled, but she kept her composure. "I'll tell the captain," she said quickly, "but you need to stay here." She disappeared into the cockpit, leaving the boys alone in the galley. The younger one hugged his knees to his chest, tears welling in his eyes. "What if it's our fault?" he whispered. "What if we did something wrong?" The older boy sat beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's not our fault. We did the right thing by telling them. They're going to handle it." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if they hadn't done enough? What if it was already too late? The plane hit another patch of turbulence, shaking just enough to rattle the overhead bins. Passengers clung to their armrests, their anxiety mounting with every jolt. The muffled thuds from below had stopped for now, but the silence that followed felt even more ominous. The boys sat huddled together in the galley, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. No one had come back to tell them what was happening, and the uncertainty was eating away at them. Inside the cockpit, the pilot and copilot were deep in conversation with air traffic control. The emergency protocol had been initiated, and the airport was clearing the runway for an immediate landing. The pilot kept his hands steady on the controls, but his mind raced with questions. He glanced at the copilot, who was staring at the security footage again, his face tense. "It's not moving anymore," the copilot said, his voice low. "But it's still there, whatever it is." "Let's not take any chances," the pilot replied. "Once we're on the ground, we'll have security sweep the plane. Until then, we keep everyone locked down." The copilot nodded, but his unease was evident. He couldn't shake the image of the shadow darting across the cargo bay, its movements too deliberate to be a malfunction or a loose piece of luggage. Whatever was down there wasn't just an object, it was something alive. In the cabin, the tension was palpable. A few passengers had started whispering theories, each one more alarming than the last. "Maybe it's a bomb," one man speculated, his voice barely above a whisper, "or a dangerous animal that got loose." A woman sitting nearby shook her head, her hands clutching the edges of her seat. "They wouldn't let us stay on board if it was a bomb," she said. "It has to be something else." The murmurs grew louder, and despite the flight attendants' best efforts to maintain order, the fear was spreading. Even the calmest passengers couldn't ignore the ominous atmosphere that hung over the cabin like a storm cloud. The boys remained silent, their eyes fixed on the cockpit door. They felt a strange mix of guilt and frustration. They had tried to warn the crew, but no one seemed to be giving them the full picture. The older boy finally leaned over to his brother, his voice barely audible. "Do you think they believe us?" His brother shrugged, his face pale. "I don't know, but I think they're scared too." The older boy opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden, sharp noise cut through the cabin. It sounded like metal groaning under pressure, followed by a faint scraping sound. The passengers froze, their eyes darting toward the floor as if they could see through it to the cargo bay below. The noise came again, louder this time, and the flight attendants rushed to reassure everyone. "Please remain seated," one of them said, her voice tight. "We're almost on the ground. Everything is under control." But her words didn't match the look in her eyes. The boys noticed it immediately, that flicker of fear she couldn't quite hide. They exchanged a glance, their unease growing. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse. In the cockpit, the pilot and copilot were trying to focus on the landing, but the strange sounds were impossible to ignore. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls, his jaw clenched. "We need to get this plane on the ground now." "We're almost there," the copilot replied, his eyes flicking to the altimeter. 5 minutes. The pilot nodded, his attention shifting back to the runway lights that were now visible in the distance. But before he could say anything else, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, followed by a shudder that rippled through the entire plane. The passengers screamed, and the boys instinctively grabbed each other, their hearts pounding. In the galley, the flight attendants were scrambling to maintain order, their voices rising over the chaos. "Everyone stay calm." One of them shouted, "We're preparing to land." The older boy couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, his fists clenched. "You have to tell us what's going on," he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "We saw it. We know it's not normal." The flight attendant hesitated, her face pale. Before she could respond, the cockpit door opened, and the pilot stepped out. His usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of grim determination. "We're landing in less than 5 minutes, he said, addressing the passengers directly. "I need everyone to remain seated and follow the crew's instructions. Do not panic. Once we're on the ground, we'll ensure everyone's safety." The passengers stared at him, their fear palpable, but the pilot didn't wait for questions. He turned to the flight attendants and spoke in a low voice, his tone urgent. "Secure the cabin. Make sure everyone is ready for an emergency evacuation if necessary." The boys watched as the flight attendants sprang into action, their movements quick and efficient. The older boy wanted to ask the pilot more questions, but before he could, the man disappeared back into the cockpit, shoving the door behind him. The plane began its final descent, the engines roaring as the runway loomed closer. The scraping sounds had stopped, but the silence felt even more oppressive. The boys huddled together, their hearts racing as they braced for whatever was about to happen. They didn't know what awaited them on the ground, but one thing was clear: this flight was far from over.